In New York, that sound was stone cracking, metal groaning, a hammer landing again and again until a mansion stopped being a mansion and became a pile of expensive dust. People gathered the way crowds gather for history, not because they were invited, but because they sensed something bigger than a building was happening. Imagine the scene. You're on a Manhattan sidewalk, cold air cutting through coats. Ahead of you is a private palace designed to look eternal. Heavy gates, carved limestone, a facade meant to say, "This family is permanent." Now the windows are empty, the rooms are exposed, the roofline looks wounded. A single blow echoes, and a chunk of the past falls into the street. Here's what most people get wrong about America's Gilded Age. They think it ended in one dramatic moment, one crash, one law, one scandal. But eras like this don't die in explosions, they die in pressure. A pressure that builds quietly until even the richest families in the country start asking a question that would have sounded insane 50 years earlier. Why are we paying to keep this alive? Because these mansions weren't just homes, they were trophies. They were public statements built on private money. They were architecture as dominance. And when the trophies started falling, one by one, what collapsed wasn't only the skyline, it was the logic of the world that created them. Tonight we're going inside that collapse, not as a list of dates, but as a chain reaction. How America built a world of extreme luxury and then made it unsustainable, economically, politically, culturally, until the Gilded Age finally snapped. And when it snapped, it left behind one haunting truth. The most powerful empires often look strongest right before they break.
For most of human history, wealth grew slowly. Land, inheritance, titles, time. The old world's rich didn't become rich overnight. They became rich over generations, with traditions to match. Then America did something different. It built a machine that could multiply wealth at industrial speed. Railroads stitched the country into one market. Steel turned skylines into factories. Oil lit streets and powered an economy that never slept. A new class of men didn't just become wealthy, they became wealthy enough to bend cities around them. And once that kind of money exists, it demands proof. It demands visible power. That's where New York steps in, because New York wasn't just a city, it was a mirror. If you could conquer New York's social scene, you didn't just have money, you had legitimacy. But legitimacy was the problem. European aristocrats had something American industrialists couldn't manufacture, a story of always. Always noble, always refined, always accepted. The new American millionaires had railroads and mines and factories, but they didn't have centuries. So they did the next best thing. They bought stone. Not modest stone, monument stone. They built homes that looked like palaces because palaces don't just shelter people, they announce hierarchy. They tell the world, we are not like you. And for a while, that strategy worked. Architecture became a weapon. Every limestone detail was a flex. Every imported marble floor was a statement. We can afford to bring the old world here and rebuild it for ourselves. But here's the catch. Speed creates weakness. When money arrives too fast, it outpaces the culture around it. It outpaces the rules. It outpaces public patience. The same industrial engine that created these fortunes also created crowded tenements, dangerous factories, exhausted workers, and a growing sense that the system was tilted. So the Gilded Age was born with a contradiction inside it, a small class living like royalty in a country built on the idea that no one should have royalty. And contradictions don't last forever.
There's a reason the richest people didn't scatter evenly across Manhattan. Wealth loves clustering because proximity is power. The moment Fifth Avenue became the address, it turned into a scoreboard. You weren't just buying a home, you were buying membership, a location that said you belong at the top. And the competition escalated fast, not just nice, not just grand, competitive, performative, almost aggressive. A mansion on Fifth Avenue wasn't built to be quiet, it was built to be noticed. If your neighbor built a ballroom, you built a larger ballroom. If they imported one kind of marble, you imported rarer marble. If they hired a famous architect, you hired the architect's rival. This wasn't only vanity, this was a social language. The building itself was a sentence, "Our family matters." And in Gilded Age society, being ignored was a kind of death. So these homes became private kingdoms. They had staff wings, service staircases, hidden corridors, entire systems designed to keep the illusion perfect. Even the mechanics of the house were part of the class structure. The people who served were meant to be invisible. The people who owned were meant to look effortless. But there was another reason Fifth Avenue mattered: land value. If you own the most valuable land, you don't just own a home, you own leverage. You own a resource that the city itself will eventually fight over. And that's why the end of the Gilded Age becomes fitical. When the age collapses, it doesn't just collapse in courtrooms and newspapers, it collapses in real estate. Because Manhattan is ruthless. It rewards what earns money per square foot. And a private palace, no matter how beautiful, is a low-efficiency use of high-efficiency land. That's the bomb planted under every mansion. Eventually, the city will want that land back. At first, the wealthy don't notice the fuse. They're too busy winning the social war. But the fuse is burning, quietly, under the sidewalk.
Money could buy buildings, but it couldn't automatically buy acceptance. New York's old elite had a defense mechanism: social rules, unwritten laws enforced by invitations, silence, and exclusion. The gatekeepers weren't politicians, they were society leaders, people who could decide whether you were in or out, regardless of your fortune. In that world, a party wasn't a party, it was a test. The guest list wasn't random, it was a map of power. The rituals mattered because rituals create hierarchy. Opera nights, club memberships, calling cards, summer retreats, debutante seasons. Who sits where, who speaks to whom, who gets talked about, and who is treated as if they don't exist. And that system did something clever. It turned social acceptance into a scarce resource. If the top circle is limited, being included becomes priceless. So the new rich played along. They learned the rules, they paid for the costumes, they built the ballrooms, they donated to the right causes. They tried to sound old, look old, behave old, because old meant legitimate. But here's the fatal weakness in gatekeeping. It depends on everyone agreeing the gate matters. The moment the outside world starts mocking the rituals, the system starts wobbling. The moment the middle class sees these parties as obscene instead of glamorous, the social magic breaks. And slowly, that's what happened. Because America was not Europe. America had mass newspapers, mass politics, and a culture that could turn against you overnight if you look like a symbol of unfairness. The Gilded Age elite wanted to live like aristocrats, but they lived in a country where public opinion could become a weapon. And once public opinion flips, the gatekeepers don't matter nearly as much as the voters.
Every chandelier, every polished staircase, every immaculate dining room was powered by something the guests were trained not to see: labor. A mansion didn't function like a normal home. It functioned like a private hotel. Meals didn't appear. Rooms didn't clean themselves. Fires didn't light themselves. Clothing didn't organize itself. It took an entire staff ecosystem. Cooks, maids, footmen, laundresses, valets, porters, dozens of people, sometimes more. And the labor wasn't occasional. It was constant. The day started early, ended late, and repeated again. The biggest trick of elite life is making effort look effortless. That illusion costs money, but it also costs human beings. And that is what made the Gilded Age fragile. Not just morally fragile, mechanically fragile. If you don't have staff, a mansion becomes unlivable. Rooms turn cold, maintenance slips, dust gathers in spaces too large to manage. A building designed for 40 workers cannot operate with 5. So what happens when the supply of domestic labor shrinks? This is where the story gets sharper, because the decline of the Gilded Age wasn't only about taxes and politics, it was also about something simple. Fewer people were willing to live inside someone else's world. As cities modernized, new jobs appeared: factories, offices, retail, services. Work that paid differently, but also offered freedom. You could go home at the end of the day. You could have privacy. You could build your own life. Domestic service, by contrast, demanded invisibility. It demanded obedience. It demanded that your existence fit inside someone else's schedule. So when new options arrived, the servant system began to break. And when the servant system breaks, the palace breaks with it. The wealthy assumed they controlled the story about themselves. They had money. They had influence. They sponsored institutions. They donated libraries and museums. They believed society would thank them. Then the tone of America shifted. A new kind of journalism began treating wealth not as a success story, but as an investigation. Instead of celebrating industrial tycoons, writers started asking harder questions. How were these fortunes built? Who paid the real cost? Who got crushed along the way? This wasn't gossip, it was exposure. And exposure is dangerous because it changes what people feel permitted to think. Once you read enough reports of corruption, monopoly power, exploitation, your respect turns into suspicion. The Gilded Age depended on admiration. Even if people envied the rich, they still needed to believe the rich deserved it. That belief was the foundation. When journalists attacked that foundation, the mansion became more than a mansion. It became evidence, proof of excess, proof of imbalance. That's when the public mood changes. And when public mood changes, politics follows. Because now reformers can say, look at the palaces, look at the tenements, look at the difference. And suddenly, the argument isn't theoretical, it's visible. The rich tried to fight back. They promoted philanthropy. They pushed good deeds as a shield. But a shield doesn't erase the story if the story is repeated. And the repetition was relentless. Newspapers, magazines, speeches, movements. The elite began to realize something. A modern mass society can turn your reputation into a battlefield. And if your reputation becomes a battlefield, your lifestyle becomes a liability. Inequality is one thing when it's abstract. It's another thing when it becomes architecture. In Gilded Age America, the contrast wasn't subtle. It was physical. You could walk from crowded tenement streets to mansion-lined avenues and feel like you'd crossed into a different country. Workers faced long hours, dangerous machinery, unstable wages. Injury could end a career. Illness could destroy a family. There was no reliable safety net. Meanwhile, the richest households spent fortunes on balls that lasted one night. That contrast wasn't only unfair, it was unstable. Because it creates a question ordinary people can't stop asking. Why do the rules protect them and not us? As labor movements grew, strikes became more than workplace conflicts. They became moral confrontations. They became proof that the bottom of society was no longer willing to accept silence. Even when strikes failed, they left behind something powerful: fear at the top. Fear that the workforce might coordinate. Fear that production could stop. fear that wealth could be interrupted. And fear changes behavior. It makes elites defensive. It makes them seek control through police, courts, private security, politics. It makes them resist reform harder. But resistance is also a signal. It tells the public the system is protecting itself. And that further fuels backlash. This is the feedback loop that cracks the Gilded Age. The more inequality becomes visible, the more pressure builds. The more pressure builds, the more control is used. The more control is used, the more people feel the system is illegitimate. And once legitimacy breaks, everything built on it starts to wobble, including the mansions. For decades, extreme fortunes grew in an environment that was shockingly friendly to the wealthy. Regulation was light, taxes were limited, giant corporations could expand fast. Then the state started to change. Progressive reforms didn't arrive as one giant revolution. They arrived as a slow squeeze. A new belief spread that the public had the right to restrain private power. Once that belief becomes mainstream, the wealthiest class faces a new reality. Your empire is no longer untouchable. Income taxation becomes part of that shift. So do antitrust actions. So do labor reforms. So do regulation of food, drugs, and corporate practices. The key isn't one policy. The key is momentum. Because the Gilded Age lifestyle depended on a certain math, keep most of what you earn, spend freely, maintain huge staff, build enormous private space, when taxes and public scrutiny rise, that math changes. Every dollar spent has an opportunity cost. Every display becomes politically risky. Every lavish party becomes a headline waiting to happen. And wealth has a strange weakness. It's powerful, but it's also easy to target once society decides it should be. A mansion is visible. A mansion is symbolic. A mansion is an easy argument. So now the elite faces a dilemma. Do you double down on display, prove you're still dominant, or do you retreat, become quieter, more modern, more strategic? In the early 1900s, many tried to keep the old style alive. They believed the storm would pass. But the storm wasn't passing. It was becoming the climate. If you want a simple explanation for why the Gilded Age ended, here it is. The system required people, and people stopped cooperating. Domestic service began to lose its grip. Young workers looked at a life of constant availability, living in someone else's home, obeying someone else's schedule, and they compared it to factory shifts, retail jobs, office work, jobs that weren't glamorous but offered something priceless, autonomy. Once workers taste autonomy, it's hard to go back. So wealthy households struggled. They raised wages, they offered benefits, but they couldn't compete with freedom. And as staffing became harder, mansions became harder. A palace is not just expensive to build, it is expensive to run forever. Heating a massive building, repairing stone, maintaining interior decoration, keeping everything spotless, that requires an army. Now imagine that army shrinking. Suddenly floors are closed, rooms go unused, standards slip. The house feels less like a showpiece and more like a burden you're constantly failing to manage. And there's a psychological shift there. When something starts to feel like a burden, you stop defending it emotionally. That's what happened to many heirs. They didn't necessarily hate the mansions, they just couldn't justify them. And justification matters because it determines what you fight to keep. If your house has become a money-burning machine with a shrinking staff and rising taxes, it stops being a dream. It becomes a problem. And problems get solved. Sometimes by selling, sometimes by demolition, sometimes by surrendering a whole era to the wrecking crew.
Then the world shattered.
World War didn't just change borders, it changed values. Mass death makes extravagance look different. Mobilization makes private luxury feel out of step with the moment. Governments expand, economies reorganize, and people get used to the idea that the state can demand sacrifice. And a generation returns home with a new perspective. They've seen hierarchy break down in trenches. They've seen the old world bleed. They've watched the idea of untouchable elites die under artillery. Back home, the wealthy still lived well, but the atmosphere shifted. Conspicuous celebration became riskier. Some families became quieter. Some adjusted. Some pretended nothing had changed. But the biggest impact was structural. War accelerates modernity. It shifts labor. It shifts gender roles. It shifts industry. It increases the power of government. It justifies higher taxation. It transforms what people consider acceptable. The Gilded Age was built for a world where huge private households could function easily and where public opinion admired excess. After war, public opinion becomes harder, sharper, less romantic about wealth. And that matters because the mansion was never only a building, it was a message. Once the message becomes unpopular, the building becomes vulnerable. By the 1920s, the Gilded Age meets its most unstoppable enemy, economics. Property taxes rise, land values explode, maintenance costs climb, staffing remains expensive and scarce. The city grows denser, louder, more commercial. And Manhattan's logic is brutal. Land must earn. A mansion takes up enormous space and houses one family. An apartment building can house dozens. A department store can generate constant revenue. An office building can turn square footage into profit. So developers look at Gilded Age palaces and see something simple: wasted value. The mansion becomes a financial mismatch with the city around it. And when heirs inherit these buildings, they often inherit the costs more than the glory. The prestige is real, but prestige doesn't pay heating bills. Prestige doesn't pay taxes. Prestige doesn't hire staff. So the decision becomes practical, not sentimental. Sell the land, take the money, move into a luxury apartment that offers status without the crushing overhead. That's when the wrecking ball becomes inevitable. Because once a property is worth more demolished than preserved, demolition isn't an attack, it's a business plan. And when a business plan spreads across a city, it becomes a wave.
At first, demolitions feel shocking. People can't imagine the city destroying its own symbols of wealth. But shock doesn't stop momentum. Once the first major houses fall, the rest become easier to sacrifice. Because every demolition creates a precedent. It tells the market, this is allowed, this is normal, this is profitable. And once it becomes normal, the romantic defense weakens. People adapt fast. Yesterday's palace becomes today's construction site. Photographs from that era are surreal. Elegant facades torn open like dolls' houses, rooms exposed to daylight, staircases leading to nowhere, carved stone reduced to rubble. What took years to build can be removed in weeks. And crowds watch, not only because it's dramatic, but because it feels symbolic. It's the city admitting, out loud, that private empires are not permanent. What replaces the mansions is important. It's not just new buildings, it's a new social order. Commerce replaces aristocratic display. Efficiency replaces spectacle. Shared luxury replaces private kingdoms. And that transition is why this story matters. Because it shows that even wealth must obey the environment it lives in. The environment changed, so wealth changed with it.
Not every mansion died. The survivors teach the real rule of endurance. Private luxury lasts longer when it becomes public purpose. Some houses transformed into museums, libraries, institutions, clubs. They gained organizational budgets, donors, and public legitimacy. Once a building is seen as cultural heritage, it has defenders. This is where the Gilded Age leaves behind its strangest legacy. Many of the greatest collections assembled by wealthy industrialists become public treasures. The irony is sharp. Men who built fortunes in a harsh system end up funding institutions that educate the public. Their names live on, not through private parties, but through public access. And in those preserved spaces, the Gilded Age becomes tangible. You can walk through rooms designed to overawe. You can see how architecture was used as status, as theater, as dominance. But most mansions didn't have that path. They weren't connected to institutions. They didn't have an endowment. They didn't have a justification beyond the family itself. And that's the difference between historic and replaceable. A palace that serves only one household is a luxury. A palace that serves culture becomes an asset. That distinction decides what survives.
The mansion didn't disappear because the elite disappeared. The elite adapted. The luxury apartment building became the new engine of high-end living, especially in Manhattan. It offered status without the impossible overhead of a private palace. Shared staff means lower cost. Centralized maintenance means efficiency. Modern utilities mean less decay. And the address still carries prestige. This shift is bigger than architecture. It's a philosophical change. It says we still want comfort, beauty, and exclusivity, but we want it in a form that makes sense in a modern city. And this is why the Gilded Age end isn't a moral fairy tale. The wealthy didn't vanish. They just stopped living in castles. The new status symbol isn't a private kingdom. It's a private elevator, a doorman, a guarded lobby, a building that feels like a fortress but runs like a machine. Luxury becomes less theatrical and more controlled, less about giant public parties, more about privacy. In other words, wealth becomes smarter, and when wealth becomes smarter, the loudest symbols, like mansions, become liabilities.
We love clean endings. A single event, a single villain, a single collapse. But the Gilded Age ended the way most systems end, through stacked pressure. Labor unrest, investigations, reform movements, taxation, war, cultural shifts, housing economics, staff shortages, modern values. None of these alone is enough to erase Fifth Avenue palaces, but together they form a vice, and the vice tightens year after year. The most dangerous part is how quiet it feels at first. The elite continue their parties, the houses still glitter, the staff still serve, the city still admires. Then, suddenly, you notice something. Fewer parties, smaller seasons, fewer servants, more headlines criticizing excess, more government power, higher costs. And then, one day, the heirs look at the house and see it clearly. This isn't a monument, it's a drain. That's when endings happen. Not in drama, but in decisions. A wrecking ball destroys stone, but its real target is an idea. The idea was that wealth could build a separate universe and live above society forever. But modern cities don't allow separate universes. They absorb everything into efficiency. Politics, markets, and public mood eventually reach even the tallest gates. So the Gilded Age falls for a simple reason. It tried to freeze time. It built monuments to permanence in a country that moves quickly. It built private palaces in a city that rewards profit. It built social rituals in a democracy that eventually questions rituals built on exclusion. And when the questioning becomes mainstream, the old style becomes unstable. It becomes something you defend awkwardly, something you downplay, something you quietly replace. That's why the end of the Gilded Age isn't only a story about rich people losing money. It's a story about a nation redefining what it tolerates. The mansions didn't just fall because they were expensive. They fell because they stopped making sense. Walk Manhattan today and you'll barely see the Gilded Age. That absence is the message. The city consumed the era and rebuilt over it. But the logic didn't disappear, because the forces that created the Gilded Age never fully went away. Wealth still clusters, prestige still attaches to location, social hierarchy still exists, just updated. And this is the uncomfortable part. The Gilded Age is not a fossil, it's a pattern. Whenever money concentrates faster than society adapts, you get pressure. Whenever pressure builds, you get backlash. Whenever backlash rises, you get reform, cultural shifts, and reinvention. The Gilded Age ended because it couldn't remain loud, so wealth learned to become quieter, more efficient, more insulated. That's why the end of Fifth Avenue mansions isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how modern power survives. It stops posing for applause and starts optimizing for endurance. And if you look closely at the city, you can still see the ghost lines where palaces once stood, hidden under glass towers and luxury storefronts like a buried civilization.
So what killed the Gilded Age? Not one law, not one war, not one crash. It died because the entire system became too expensive to operate, too politically dangerous to celebrate, and too culturally outdated to defend. It built its identity on spectacle, on being seen, on winning the social stage, on announcing dominance through architecture and ritual. But modern America slowly turned against spectacle. It demanded restraint, it demanded fairness, it demanded explanation. And it built a city where land and profit speak louder than nostalgia. The final twist is that the Gilded Age didn't end with the rich suddenly becoming poor. It ended with the rich becoming practical. They stopped funding palaces and started funding efficiency. They moved from private kingdoms to managed luxury. They traded ballrooms for penthouses. They traded armies of servants for buildings that do the work. The mansions fell because the era that justified them fell first. And that's the lesson. When a system depends on constant public performance, it collapses the moment the audience stops applauding. Because power can survive without applause, but spectacle cannot. If you want more documentaries on the places where wealth, history, and hidden power collide, subscribe and tell me the next building, neighborhood, or era you want us to expose.